Good evening and welcome to our latest edition in this wonderful series of talks. Joined with Corinne. Very Chodesh Tov to everybody. Welcome to our latest edition. And that's what happens when you have your YouTube stream on at the same time, so it comes on. Anyway, sorry about that. As I said, welcome to our latest talk here in Polish with Corinne. And again, we're very delighted to welcome today Rabbi Stu Halpen, who is somebody who is very, very well known in America in terms of work he does in Yeshiva University and works also at the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought. And he develops many education initiatives for the American population and for general studies. And he's actually co-edited 16 books. And the one that I guess we're talking about at the moment is Reflections on Ruth, Book of the People, Torah with Western Thought, and Drashot LaDorot. So these are wonderful books, and Drashot LaDorot certainly is one that I have spent many hours being inspired by the work of Rabbi Lamb, which Rabbi Halpen was very much instrumental in bringing to the public. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Rabbi Dr. Stu Halpen to tonight's show. Good evening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Shor.
As I must say, Drashot LaDorot, as I said, I don't know when it came out, but it's literally been a game changer for so many communal rabbis in terms of the incredible depth of drashot contained there. So thank you for bringing that to the rabbinic world or to the general world. And it certainly has inspired thousands of people I know who read it regularly every Shabbat. It's a remarkable piece. But tonight we're going to be talking about, or you're going to be talking about, I'm going to get The Lion, the Pit, and the Wardrobe, Daniel, Yosef, Esther, and the struggles of being a diaspora Jew. It's a fascinating topic, a very relevant topic to all of us, whether in America, here in the UK, but certainly in America, the largest diaspora community in the world by far. And we very much look forward to hearing your words tonight. I'll leave it to you now to give us this fascinating shiur, and then I'll come back later on so we can discuss some of the words you have said. So, Rabbi Halpen, looking forward to hearing the shiur.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. So around a week ago, in her resignation letter to the New York Times heard around the world, my friend Barry Weiss mentioned how bullying colleagues at the paper had criticized her for the subject of some of the opinion pieces that she had written. They had often asked her, she said, why she was, quote, writing about the Jews again, end quote. A longtime advocate of proud Jewish identity, Barry is no stranger to the dangers that come with recognizable Jewishness. In her National Jewish Book Award-winning volume, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, she referred to, quote, applying the kippah or Magen David test, end quote, in which she recounts that she began wearing a Magen David necklace after the Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue shooting in her hometown, and admitted to her readers, quote, you know your community better than I do. In Pittsburgh or New York, I would never hesitate to wear a Magen David. In Paris or Berlin, I hope I would make the same choice, but I am not sure, end quote. So this question of how outward to be with one's Jewish identity reminded me of a news story the Times ran in 2015 profiling what was left of the Yemenite Jewish community. So this Jewish community in Yemen, which had once numbered in the thousands and was hundreds of years old, had whittled down to just 55 Jews. And the story focused largely on two brothers left from among these 55 Jews in Yemen, Suleiman Jacob, age 45, and Abraham Jacob, age 55. The story is said as follows. Like the men, most of the boys in the Jacob family wear earlocks, payas, a proud sign of who they are in an otherwise Muslim society. Now, Suleiman, he keeps his earlocks thin and long enough so that when he goes out, he can tuck them out of sight under an Arabic-style headscarf, which also covers the skull caps that the men and boys all wear. It's a shame that we have to do that sometimes, but we do, he said. Abraham, the other brother, says he refuses to hide his earlocks. I fear none but God, he told the Times. So perhaps not surprisingly, this tension, this debate over how to broadcast or not one's Jewish identity in the diaspora is far from new. In fact, it traces all the way back to the very beginning of our Jewish story, as described in the pages of our Tanakh. So as we're going to see today, and I hope to delve into more deeply in my upcoming book with Magid on Megillat Esther's impact on the history of the United States of America, the story of Danielle, Yosef, and Esther address and even debate this very question, just like those brothers in Yemen, and so many of us across the globe today. How can a Jew survive and even thrive outside of the land of Israel? and how Jewish should one look and one be when attempting to do so. And by the way, if anyone watching in England wants to plan a sequel volume titled Esther in the UK, feel free to email me after. Obviously, the story of Yosef rising to power in Egypt is the oldest of the three stories that we're going to be looking at today. The story of Danielle and Esther were put into writing, Chazal tell us, in Bava Batra, during the era of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, around 1,000 years after the story of Yosef took place, long after it had been seared into the historical collective memory of the Jewish people. So we all know the story of Yosef, and we all know the story of Esther. Some of us might know the story of Danielle less well. So to recap, no spoilers, but Danielle was taken from amongst certain cultural and intellectual elite of the Jews to Bavel a few years before the destruction of Bayit Rishon in 570 BCE. He was raised in the king's palace, and while in Bavel, first under Babylonian rule and later under Persian and Median rule, he experienced a series of episodes, including having his friends thrown into the fiery furnace for not bowing down to an idol. Danielle himself was thrown into the lion's den in a story that we're going to examine in a few minutes. Danielle interpreted the writing on the wall of Belshazzar's feast, and he interpreted and experienced himself various dreams throughout his story. Broadly speaking, the stories of Yosef first, and then Esther and Danielle deal with a Jewish hero or heroes trying to navigate life in the diaspora. More specifically, though, as Chazal, our rabbis, and many modern scholars, particularly just in recent years alone, Professor Yoni Grossman in his book Megillat Starim, Yorm Hazoni in his book The Dawn, The Political Teachings of the Book of Esther, which was republished a couple of years ago as God and Politics in Esther, the Da Mikra commentary, and my colleague at Yeshiva University, Professor Aaron Kohler, in his book Esther and Ancient Jewish Thought. All of them have pointed out there are countless literary and thematic parallels between these three stories, way beyond the level of pure coincidence, which make it readily apparent that the story of Yosef seems to have directly influenced the way that Megillat Esther was told, as well as the way Sefer Daniel was written. So today we're going to look at some parallels between the story of Yosef in Mitzrayim and Megillat Esther. Following that, we're going to look at some parallels between the story of Yosef and Sefer Daniel. Then we're going to look at commonalities between all three. And we'll then examine in a close literary reading the story of Daniel in the lion's den, arguably the most famous story in all of Sefer Daniel, and see that while Esther and Daniel might have a lot of similarities influenced by the story of Yosef, the book of Daniel actually takes a starkly different, maybe even oppositional stance than the book of Esther does on how a diaspora Jew should behave if he or she is to survive and thrive in the diaspora. So first, follow along with me in the source sheets. Let's look at some narrative and thematic parallels between the story of Yosef in Egypt and Megillat Esther. So if you look at source number 1, starting on the left side, we have Sefer Bereshit on the left and Megillat Esther on the right. So follow along with me. So on the left-hand side, to paint the scene of source number 1, Yosef is languishing in jail in the land of Egypt. And we read, So on the third day, the birthday of Paro, he made a party for all of his servants. Parallel to this mention of making a party for all of one's servants on the third of something, we read at the very beginning of the story of Esther, that Achashverosh, the king, like Paro, made a party, and like Paro is for all of his servants. And again, it was at the third of something. In the case of Paro, is 3 days, and in the case of Achashverosh, it was 3 years. Source number 2. Source number 2, we read about how the Sar Hamashkim, Paro's butler, if you will, he did not remember the Jew who he had met in jail, namely Yosef. Eventually, however, the next parak we're told by the Ber Sar Mashkim et Paro lemor et chatai ani maskir hayom. He says, "Oh right, I forgot to tell you about this Jew who I had forgotten about," and that's what allows Yosef to rise, to emerge from jail, and to interpret the dreams of Paro. And on the Esther side, on the right-hand column, we read after the episode of Vashti where she had refused to come to the king. He remembered the episode of Vashti after he recovered from his drunken stupor in which he demanded that she show up, and she refused. So in both stories, it's not just that this word Zachar, remember, appears, but it's that this remembering on the part of a character allows for the rise of the Jewish hero or heroine. So the remembering of the Saramashkim allows for the rise of Yosef, and the remembering on the part of Achashverosh about Vashti allows for Esther eventually to be chosen. Now on to parallel number 3 between the story of Yosef and the story of Esther. So if you look inside at the Hebrew, it's easier to follow along than the English in this case. We read Yaseh Paro v'yavkei pikidim. The advice that Yosef offers to Achashverosh is that Paro should appoint officers to do what? Look at the next pasuk. V'kbitzu et kol ochel hashanim hatavot. They should gather all the food of the good years. Now in Esther, there's strikingly similar recounting verbiage used to describe what? The advice of the officers of Achashverosh to gather women. We're told, here there's also pikidim, there are also officers being appointed, but they're not gathering good food, but rather they're gathering good-looking women, which of course is indicative of the commodification of women in the time of Esther and in the perspective of the kingdom of Achashverosh. That anyone who would declare a beauty contest is clearly not treating women the way that we treat men are supposed to treat women today, but rather treating them as commodities, just like essentially food to be consumed, as in the story of Yosef. Source number 4, parallel number 4, recounts in both contexts, you can read inside, the riding on either a horse or a chariot and the calling before of 2 characters. Yosef gets to ride on the chariot of the Mishneh LaMelech and is called before Avrech. And in Esther, we read that Haman took the garb and horse and raided Mordechai, paraded him through the city, and proclaimed before him, "This shall be done for he who the king wishes to honor." Parallel number 5. In both stories, both the story of Yosef and the story of Esther, we read of a nudge. What I mean is, in both stories, happens to be a non-Jewish character or characters who are nudging to the Jewish character to do something, to give in. In the story of Yosef, it's Esha Potiphar who's doing the nudging, asking Yosef, nudging him yom each day to sleep with her, and he refuses. In the parallel case in the story of Esther, the people of Shushan, Jews, the others, looking and are saying over and over again to Mordechai, why are you not bowing down? So yom vayom, day in and day out, they're saying, why are you not bowing down to Haman? Why are you not obeying the decree? In both cases, the refusal of the Jew to do what is being nudged of him is actually due to a rather unexpected religious reason. By that I mean, Yosef says, I will not sleep with you, Esha Potiphar, because if I did, it would be a sin against God. Now, until that point, Yosef had not been invoking God's name. So too in the story of Esther, until the point where Mordechai says, I'm not going to bow down, because the pasuk says, Ki yirahem asher hu Yehudi, because he told them that he was Jewish, you weren't expecting as a reader necessarily the character to tell you, I'm not doing X because it would be against my religion. But in both cases, there's clearly a refusal on religious grounds to do what's being asked. Parallel number 6. In both the story of Yosef and the story of Esther, we have this rather unusual Hebrew word, vayita'apak, that appears in both places. In the context of Yosef, it appears in the context of him refusing to reveal himself, at least originally, to the brothers that show up down in Mitzrayim, and it appears in the context of Haman refraining himself and going home and fetching his friends and Zereshu's wife after he's upset over what he had to do with Mordechai. So this rather rare word pops up in both places, which usually is indicative of stories meant to be read in parallel. As you can see from parallel number 7, there's also the commonality between the two of ring removal. The king in each story takes off his ring and hands it to the Jewish hero. Parallel number 8. So this one I cheated a little bit. In case you didn't notice, most of the sources so far in the story of Yosef are pulled from, appropriately so, Sefer Breshit. At the very beginning of Sefer Shemot, the next book of Chumash, we read as follows: we read about a different paro, a different one than the one that Yosef dealt with, but he levies taskmasters over the people, over the Israelites in Egypt. Now, it sounds like this idea of putting upon someone, misim, putting upon taskmasters, might remind you or might be recalled in Esther, where we read at the very end of the book, that Achashverosh had levied a tax. So taskmaster and tax in Hebrew, you could see, is a similar sounding, similar looking root, misim and mas. And some of you might go to shuls, whether or not you were able to go do the various this most recent Purim, but some of you might recall being in shul over the years on Purim and hearing people boo the same way they boo the mention of Haman. They also boo the mention of taxes at the end of the book, the mas at the end of the book. So there's this parallel between these appendix, if you will, of the story of Yosef and the story of Esther, with this mention of misim or mas, which is meant to convey both contexts are very much galut, very much diaspora context at the end of both stories. It's not as if everything is ending up well when these stories finish. Parallel number 9. In both stories, both in the Yosef story, where his brothers go down to Egypt and don't recognize him, they're not able to see who he is, that he is in fact Yosef, their brother, so too in the story of Esther, you could follow along in Hebrew and English. The idea of recognizing someone as a Jew is obviously something that is very fraught in the tale. We know, of course, that Esther does not tell people that she is a Jew until the very end, until she needs to in order to save her people. Mordecai, as we mentioned a couple minutes ago, he seemingly reveals, at least overtly, the Jewishness of the reason behind his refusal to bow down to Haman. And one could read, and in fact some have read this, as Mordecai revealing for the very first time even his Jewishness to his neighbors. What do I mean? So Rabbi Hanan Samet, an educator in Israel, and Michael Eisenberg, who is a venture capitalist who wrote a book in Hebrew called Kacha Ya'aseh Yehudi. In English, it's called The Vanishing Jew. They both have made the case in recent years that Mordecai and Esther, being named as they were after pagan gods and goddesses Marduk and Ishtar, and having seemingly not overt signs of their Jewishness, they were Jews who kept their Jewishness close to the vest. They were not recognizable as Jewish. They were not walking around with Magen David necklaces or a kippot. Or rather, until asked or until pressed or until a crisis came that was uniquely Jewish in circumstance, they were not outwardly wearing their Judaism on their sleeve. As scholar Carolyn Sharp puts it in her book, Irony and Meaning in the Hebrew Bible, quote, the Joseph material, meaning the Yosef story, shows a keen interest in insider-outsider boundaries and assimilation, investiture and divestiture of political power, and the masking and unmasking of identity as it relates to power. Similarly, as she adds about Esther, in which we are told at the end that further details about the story can be found in the books of Persia and Media, the Megillah can be read as arguing, assimilated Jews may survive in the diaspora without God, but only at the cost of their moral integrity, at the cost of rewriting the Torah, at the cost of inducting their own leaders into the annals of despicable foreign rulers. As Rachel Edelman summarizes the similarities between these two stories, between Esther and Yosef navigating how to survive governmentally as individuals, how Jewish to be in the diaspora, we read as follows. In both these tales of Jew or Hebrew in the diaspora, God is conspicuously absent. There's no revelation, there's no prophecy, there's no miraculous intervention. Yet the divine hand is palpable beneath the mask of the Egyptian viceroy, that's Yosef, and the crown of the Persian queen. As Yosef and Esther negotiate their own visibility and invisibility. That's a way of summarizing, writ large, some of these parallels between all the negotiating of Jewish identity and survival that Yosef and Esther have to do in their respective tales. Now let's look at comparisons between the Yosef story and Sefer Danielle. Source number 1 in section number 2. So in both of the stories, there's mention of someone's faces being destroyed. Za'af, the shoresh in Hebrew. So in the story of Yosef, we're told that the face of the Sar Mashkim and the Sar Ophim are distraught because they just had the dreams that they're in dire need of Yosef interpreting. In Sefer Danielle, as I mentioned before, Danielle is among the young people, the rising intellectual elite taken to Babylonia, and a Babylonian official is put in charge of his care and their care. And Danielle refuses to eat the Babylonian food, seemingly because of kashrut. He only eats the fruits and vegetables and not the food that he's meant to be served by the Babylonians. And the officer put in charge of taking care of him says, I'm going to get in trouble if you don't eat the food that I'm trying to give to you, because your faces are going to be distraught by not eating properly, and I could lose my job, or even worse, I could potentially lose my head. So the same shoresh of za'af, that same root, appears in both stories. A rather unusual shoresh, rather unusual root word. Source number 2, parallel number 2, in this comparison of Yosef and Danielle, we read of characters who have ruach Elokim, the spirit of God. Not a very common element, not super rare, but not super common in Tanakh, and it appears in both stories. Parallel number 3 is, of course, the interpretation of dreams. We're told that Yosef gives credit to God for the ability that he demonstrates to interpret dreams, and Daniel, in his story, he interprets dreams as well. And he actually, you could say, out Yosef's Yosef. By that I mean, Yosef, we know, was told certain dreams by Sar Mashkim, Sar Ophim, and by Paro, and he then interprets them. Daniel, on the other hand, he has a harder challenge. He's told by Nebuchadnezzar, Melech Bavel, the king of Bavel, I want you to tell me my dream, and I want you to interpret it. And this is something that the officials of Nebuchadnezzar are not able to do, but Daniel comes along and he's able to both recount for Nebuchadnezzar his dream and interpret it. So it kind of takes Yosef up a notch. He out Yosef's Yosef. And let's look at parallel number 4, the last one in this section. As we're going to see again in a bit, Daniel on the right-hand column is thrown into the lion's den, and Yosef in the earlier story in the left-hand column is, of course, thrown into the pit by his brothers. So both are thrown into a pit with, pardon the pun, their fate very much up in the air. Now let's look at parallels between all 3 of the stories. So parallel number 1 in all 3 of the stories is, you can follow along in the Hebrew or English. I'm not going to read it, but you can scan it, is all 3 stories are about Jews ripped from their homes in Israel. So, of course, Yosef is sold down to Egypt by his brothers. Esther, we know the ancestors of Mordechai and Esther had been exiled from Yerushalayim. And Daniel, as we've already mentioned a couple of times, had been taken from his home in Israel. Parallel number 2. Parallel number 2 is a rather rare instance of being told that certain characters are good looking. Now, unlike, say, Homeric narratives, ancient epics, in which we're told very specific things about characters' scars or how they looked, we're not often told in Chazal, rather in Tanakh, how characters look, what are physical characteristics of their appearance, unless it plays a role in the plot. So in the story of Yosef, we're told that he's good looking because, of course, that has what to do with Eshet Potiphar trying to seduce him. So too in Esther. Esther obviously is taken as part of a beauty contest, so we're told that she's good looking. And also Daniel is part of the elite. We're told that he too is without blemish and is handsome. Parallel number 3. In all 3 of the stories, in the story of Yosef, who has a nickname or an Egyptian name, Tzavna Paneach, he has both his Jewish name and a foreign name. Hadassah/Esther, of course, also has a Jewish name and a foreign name. And Daniel, being his Jewish name, is given a Babylonian name of Belteshazzar. So, of course, this is something very common in diaspora Jewry. I myself, my Hebrew name, spoiler alert, is not Stu, but is rather Tzvi Nachman, which is what my Babi and my Zaidi call me. But my English name, my American name, is Stu. And oftentimes when I'm visiting Israel, Israeli cab drivers give me a rough time and say, Eza Shem Zeh Stu, because clearly that is not a Hebrew name. Parallel number 4. Parallel number 4, commonality between all these stories, is that there's the role played by a eunuch, a saris. So Potiphar, we're told, Sris Paro, he is someone whose wife is, presumably not surprisingly, a little restless, and therefore goes after Yosef, and he is a eunuch who Yosef had found favor in his eyes. So too in the story of Esther, the person put in charge of the women who are to be at Achashverosh's beck and call as following the contest is a eunuch. And at this point, you're probably not surprised to find out that Sefer Daniel also has a eunuch who looks favorably upon, or sympathy upon, the Jewish character. Parallel number 5 is that in all three stories, a character is described as the second to the king. Yosef, we're told, rode in the chariot of the second of the king, as we mentioned. So too in Esther, and so too in Danielle, the Jewish characters are appointed to a number 2 position in the kingdom. Parallel number 6, that is, between all three of the stories, is the idea of a king's disturbed sleep leading to the rise of the Jew. So Paro, we know, had dreams that kept him awake, and he was very disturbed by how to interpret them. In the story of Esther, Achashverosh can't sleep at night, and he orders the book of his chronicles taking out, which allows for the rise of Mordechai to prominence. And in Sefer Daniel, as we've already mentioned, King Nebuchadnezzar, he has dreams that disturb him. And in all three of these instances, the Jewish character rises to meet the need of the disturbed king's sleep and to prominence as a direct result of that king not being able to sleep. Parallel number 7. I had to justify, of course, the title of the shiur, The Lion, the Pit, and the Wardrobe. And so parallel number 7, you see how in all three of the stories, there is the wearing of a special royal wardrobe by characters in all three stories. So Yosef, when he becomes Mishneh LaMelech, he wears fancy royal clothes. Mordechai, of course, does the same. And so too does Danielle. That's commonality number 7, the fancy royal wardrobe in all three stories. Number 8, in all three stories, drinking plays a role. We've already mentioned the prominence of the Saramashkim in the story of Yosef. Esther is well known for his various and sundry parties. And Danielle, too, recounts a party in which the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash were drunken out of. Parallel number 9 is the mention, the appearance, that is, of Chachamim. You could see it underlined, Chachamim, wise people in all three of the stories. And parallel number 8, well, this will conclude the section. In all three stories, bowing and not bowing play a role. Yosef's brothers bow before him when they arrive in the land of Egypt. And we've already mentioned how pivotal of a role Mordechai's refusal to bow to Haman plays in his story. And in Sefer Daniel, the friends of Daniel get thrown into the fiery furnace due to them not bowing before the king and the king's idol. In all three stories, bowing and not bowing play a crucial role. So as Mati Friedman writes in his recent book recounting the spies that operated in the Middle East during the early years of the land of Israel, next source, double identity has always been part of life for Jews. Members of a minority often outwardly indistinguishable from the majority. You wonder how much to show or hide at different times, how the sides of you fit, and whether it's possible to abandon one side altogether. And that can very much apply to the navigating that the stories are doing by portraying their characters trying to survive in the diaspora. So as we see, the book of Danielle is chock full of parallels both to the story of Yosef and the story of Esther, as all of these stories navigate questions of identity and dual identity. So now I want to look at the story of Danielle in the lion's den, and with this we'll conclude, to see how Danielle offers a strikingly opposite reading of or suggestion or recommendation or endorsement of how Jewish to be in the diaspora. So if you're a very quick native biblical Aramaic speaker, you can follow along in the biblical Aramaic, or if we skip ahead to the English translation, some of us might be more comfortable following along that way. You could always go back into the psukim inside to check it out. Okay, so let's follow along with me. Darius the Mede, this is from Sefer Daniel, recounting the story of Daniel and the lions. Then Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. It pleased Darius to appoint over the kingdom 120 satraps. So I can't see you raising your hand out there, but I'd imagine you might be inclined to raise your hand and say, wouldn't it have been awesome if the verse in Daniel said 127? Why? Because that is the number of provinces in the kingdom of Achashverosh. But unfortunately for us, we're off by 7. Now, maybe it's like gematria, where you can be numerology, where you can be off by a little bit. Actually, an early Greek translation of Daniel has on this verse the number 127 instead of 120. So presumably this early Greek Jewish translator was trying to align exactly this mention of 120 with 127, the mention of that number in the story of Esther. But either way, it sounds somewhat similar, if not exactly the same. So to be in charge of the whole kingdom, over them were 3 ministers, one of them Danielle, to whom these satraps reported, in order that the king not be troubled. So what's interesting here is, this also shades of Esther on some level. When you think about it, Haman, and some modern scholars have pointed this out, Haman was promoted to be second to the king after what? After an attempt on the king's life. So it has been suggested that to take the heat off of Achashverosh, who Bigtan and Teresh had just tried to assassinate, Haman was put in charge so that if anyone would be upset at a government official, it would not be the king himself, but would rather be his number 2, who, oh, by the way, everyone is now ordered immediately to have to bow down to. So to here, it's possible that the king wanted to avoid any political heat or pushback or revolution, and that should rise up against or fall to his second in command, of which Danielle was one of them. So this man, Danielle, surpassed the other ministers and satraps by virtue of his extraordinary spirit. The king considered setting him over the whole kingdom. The ministers and satraps looked for some fault in Danielle's conduct in matters of state, but they could find neither fault nor corruption, inasmuch as he was trustworthy and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Those men then said, "We are not going to find any fault with this Danielle, unless we find something against him in connection with the laws of his God." So in contrast to Mordechai here, in contrast to the story of Esther, everyone knows this character is Jewish the whole time. Everyone knows that Danielle is someone who is overt in his Judaism. It's not like with Mordechai, where he tells other characters that he is Jewish in a way that they might be surprised by. After all, his name is Marduk, by giving them the reason that he had to refuse to bow to Haman. But with Danielle, everyone knows the whole time Danielle is overtly Jewish. Then these ministers, and we'll see how Jewish he is in exactly a second. Then these ministers and satraps came thronging into the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the ministers of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, companions, and governors," it sounds, of course, like the endless lists of advisors giving advice to Achashverosh in the story of Esther, "are in agreement that a royal ban should be issued under sanction of an oath, that whoever shall address a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, during the next 30 days shall be thrown into the lion's den." So like in Esther, we have a decree here that is a national decree, but it's really meant to get at one Jew. What do I mean? In the story of Esther, there's an entire decree that people of the kingdom of Achashverosh are allowed to wipe out the Jews, really as an excuse to get at one Jew, namely Mordechai, who had refused to bow down to Haman. So to here, we have the entire national law being written really to get at one Jew, Daniel. So issue the ban, O king, and put it in writing, so that it be unalterable as the law of the Medes and the Persians, just like in Esther here, there's unalterable laws that may not be abrogated. Thereupon King Darius put the ban in writing. We're in verse number 11. When Daniel learned that it had been put in writing, he went to his house, in whose upper chamber he had windows made facing Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he knelt down, prayed, and made confession to his God, as he had always done. Whoa. So let's take a step back here. So there's a decree, thou shalt not daven, thou shalt not pray to anyone other than the king. So Daniel gets that, fax in his fax machine. He sees it on Twitter, and he says, okay, got it. There's a law, no davening to any gods. You can only daven to the local god and the local king. And he says, okay, great. Now I have to go daven mincha. So he not only davens, he davens like he's always been doing 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem, facing Yerushalayim. Now, every element of this verse is in contrast to the story of Esther, which, of course, notoriously does not mention God's name. Even when the Jews are fasting, we're not told that they daven. There's no mention of mitzvot in the book of Esther, let alone davening 3 times a day. And Yerushalayim does not seem to be the focus of characters in the story of Esther, whereas here, very clearly, a diaspora Jew has been praying and continues to pray 3 times a day to Yerushalayim. In fact, it's been suggested by Israeli scholars in recent years, including Rabbi Yoni Grossman and Rabbi Menachem Leibtag, that the entirety of the book of Esther is actually a satire making fun of diaspora Jews for not concentrating enough on the land of Israel, not going back to the land of Israel, even as scholars have suggested the story of Esther itself takes place when the second temple of Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash, has already been rebuilt. And the Jews of Shushan should have been in Israel at that time. They should have leveraged whatever political power they had, maybe even at the end of the book, if not earlier, and been in the land of Israel. And it's possible, this reading suggests, the terrible events that happened to them, as instigated by Haman, are a direct result of them not concentrating fully on and possibly being assimilated, fully on Israel, and possibly being assimilated into the local Persian Shushan culture. Okay, back to Danielle. Then those men came thronging in and found Danielle petitioning his God in supplication. Not surprisingly, presumably on purpose, Danielle, again, facing a window, doing exactly what the decree was not to do, he gets caught immediately. They then approached the king and reminded him of the royal ban. Did you not put in writing a ban that whoever addresses a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, during the next 30 days shall be thrown into a lion's den? The king said in reply, the order stands firm as a law of the Medes and Persians that may not be abrogated. Thereupon they said to the king, Danielle, one of the exiles of Judah, pays no heed to you, O king, or to the ban that you put in writing. 3 times a day he offers his petitions to his God. Upon hearing that, the king was very disturbed, and he set his heart upon saving Danielle, and until the sun set, made every effort to rescue him. So here, of course, we see shades of the story of Esther, with the king not being able to sleep well, and eventually, as we'll see, rewarding the Jewish character. Then those men came thronging into the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that any ban that the king issues under sanction of oath is unalterable. You have no out here. But by the king's order, Danielle was then brought and thrown into the lion's den. The king spoke to Danielle and said, Your God whom you serve so regularly will deliver you. Here, Danielle is so oppositional to the story of Esther that not only do Jewish characters pray to kings, the foreign king, is invoking the Jewish God. Verse 18, Pasuk Yudchet, a rock was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his signet, just like things are sealed with the signet of the king in Esther, and with the signet of his nobles, so that nothing might be altered concerning Danielle. The king then went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and his sleep fled from him. And here we see a contrast with Esther, in which the king and seemingly everyone else is constantly partying and feasting. Here the king is not feasting, but is rather fasting. Verse 20. Then at the first light of dawn, the king arose and rushed to the lion's den. As he approached the den, he cried to Danielle in a mournful voice. The king said to Danielle, Danielle, servant of the living God, was the God whom you serve so regularly able to deliver you from the lions? Danielle then talked with the king. O king, live forever, he said from the bottom of the pit. My God sent his angel, who shut the mouths of the lions so that they did not injure me, inasmuch as I was found innocent by him, nor have I, O king, done you any injury. The king was very glad and ordered Danielle to be brought out of the den. Danielle was brought up out of the den. No injury was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. So we are told explicitly in Sefer Danielle, the uncompromisingness of Danielle and his Judaism was the reason he was saved. Then by order of the king, those men who had slandered Danielle were brought, and together with their children and wives were thrown into the lion's den themselves. They had hardly reached the bottom of the den when the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. When King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language that inhabit the earth, may your well-being abound. I have hereby given an order that throughout my royal domain men must tremble in fear before the God of Danielle, for he is the living God who endures forever. His kingdom is indestructible, and his dominion is to the end of time. In other words, Danielle, by being uncompromising in his Judaism, had made a huge Kiddush Hashem, so much so, he had sanctified God's name so much so, that the king, the non-Jewish king, ends up giving a Dvar Torah about how great the Jewish God is. So different, of course, than the absence of God in the story of Esther. So as Yoram Hazoni puts it in summarizing the message of Danielle, next source, according to this way of looking at things, there is no need for the Jew to make even the smallest compromise of any of his principles to advance in a foreign court, because political success depends entirely on scrupulous observance of traditional Jewish ritual and faith. Thus, keeping kosher miraculously saves Danielle and his fellows, makes them stronger and more handsome than those who eat the meat served by the Babylonian king. And the refusal to follow state laws that conflict with Judaism is of no consequence. The death penalty miraculously fails to work when applied to Jews, and a swift demise awaits those who attempt to enforce it. The secret to success is therefore piety in its most obvious form. Sacrifice nothing to the law, and salvation will come from heaven, without much waiting or speculation required to see it. That's Sefer Daniel. Or as Adam Kirsch, now at the Wall Street Journal, puts it in his book, The People in the Books, 18 Classics of Jewish Literature, The message of these stories could not be clearer. Jews in the diaspora are given great opportunities. After all, Danielle rises to become a chief royal counselor. They're constantly tempted by the temptation to renounce their religion, to act more like the people around them. It is a Jewish duty to resist that temptation and remain faithful to Jewish practices, even to the point of martyrdom. God is watching over the Jews and will make sure that any sacrifice for his sake is rewarded. That's Danielle. Now Esther. What makes the book of Esther so powerful, what separates it from almost every book in the Bible and enables it to speak immediately to the modern reader, is its rejection of each one of these consoling pieties. Esther too tells the story of Jews under Persian rule and of the temptation and challenges they face. Here again are Jews who undergo exile, adopt non-Jewish names, and rise to positions of influence. They are challenged to bow down to their enemies and forsake their ancestral customs. But in Esther, God is not there to intervene and rescue people from the fiery furnace or from the lion's den. Instead, it is only very good luck, a series of fortunate coincidences that allows Esther and her uncle Mordecai to prevent a wholesale genocide of the Jews of Persia. As Yoram Hazony summarizes in the next source, in exile, whether in ancient Persia or in a more contemporary one, Jewish life must somehow persist without the immense resources made available by independent sovereign power, like there is in Israel. In exile, Jews must live in dispersion, their institutions weak, their concerns wandering far from Jewish things, and their politics alienated from every obvious source of cohesiveness, direction, and strength. It is clear at the outset that under such conditions, there is no possibility of freely seeking and implementing any Jewish ideal. To live in a society ruled by others means that the government and the laws are not the product of a Jewish concern for the general public interest, and they are certainly not the result of an interest in the well-being of the Jews as a nation. That Jewish intellectual endeavors are under constant pressure, whether overt or implicit, to conform to alien norms, and that Jewish leadership, if it is capable and effective, is perpetually viewed with a certain measure of suspicion and even fear, both by the community of non-Jews and by members of the Jewish community concerned that Jewish success may be interpreted by the Gentiles as a challenge to their authority. Thus, exile, while never precluding entirely the possibility of Jewish power, nevertheless establishes a formidable presumption against it, a presumption that has ominous theological echoes in the fact that even the most devout come to feel that the way has been lost and begin to speak, as though in winter, of God having hidden his face, like in the book of Esther, from his people. As my colleague at Yeshiva University, my friend, Stern College for Women professor and journalist Avital Shizik-Goldschmidt once wrote in the Israeli paper Haaretz, this is the inescapable condition of the diaspora Jew, and the Orthodox may feel it more potently. How many secular colleagues and relatives laugh nervously at the way we dress, the way we name our children, the way we choose these consuming lifestyles? Do you have to be Jewish in everything you do? So as we've seen today, the books of Esther and Danielle have different answers to this question. Do we have to be outwardly Jewish in everything we do? And if we are so, will that help us or will that hurt us? Danielle's answer to the question of do you have to be Jewish in everything you do is a resounding yes. Yes, we do. Esther's, however, is not so clear. It's more equivocal. At the end of the day, though, both stories wrestle with the legacy of the earliest story of the Jew in the diaspora, of Yosef, how to maintain your Jewish identity, survive and thrive while in a foreign land. Hopefully, by delving further into these stories as we did together today, we can think in a deeper way about how our tradition deals with these issues, and through our learning, bring about the ultimate redemption when we will all be in the land of Israel, and the struggles of being a diaspora Jew will no longer matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Rabbi Halpen. Really fascinating. And I think for me, hearing the commonalities and the differences, I mean, it reminds me of a Menachem Begin, the wonderful book, The Prime Ministers, and it's something that I quote very regularly in terms of the diaspora today, when he quotes the pasuk from Bilam about Am Levdad Yishkan, and Begin says that the idea, that's the whole point. If we cease dwelling alone, we cease to exist, and the idea we have to stay, like Danielle, sort of faithful to our traditions. And I think in America we've seen where people have left those traditions, assimilation is rife. So it's interesting that I relate much more to the Danielle kind of type of Jew in diaspora than I kind of do to the Esther. Well, I mean, I don't know if that's you feel that makes sense in today's.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I see them as along a spectrum. On some level, the question is, how hiddenness, does one want to tuck in Magen David or wear a baseball hat on certain areas? I don't know if you've read Deborah Lipstat's recent book on anti-Semitism, but she jokes about how whenever she's in Europe and needs to find the local synagogue, she just looks for a man in a button-down shirt wearing a baseball hat and knows inevitably that person will be heading to the local shul. So I think there's the gradations, and everyone makes their own cheshbon, their own calculation about how overtly to wear, their tefillin on their sleeve or their Magen David necklace out there, and in each context, there are various calculations to take into account.
Well, I guess it depends where you are in the world and the community you're in. And I think obviously we've got to be very thankful that I think to be a Jew today in diaspora, okay, it's certainly in the UK and America and the Western world is probably, it's a wonderful place. But yes, there is the anti-Semitism, but in terms of the freedom to practice our Judaism, I think is I think it was unparalleled, but certainly it is. Or as Rabbi Sachs says, we have the greatest freedom to practice it, but we've had the greatest, unfortunately, freedom from people leaving Judaism and assimilation, which is always the ultimate dilemma. You've got the freedom, but that means you don't have to be.
Right. And speaking of freedom, I'm interested in thinking about, as I plan this book on Esther in America, and thinking about and documenting and learning with people how Esther is navigating of these freedoms actually shaped the project of America itself, and how the religious freedom that the Jews actually, and the liberation, if you will, that the Jews experienced by the end of the book has actually informed American history throughout its history.
Interesting. I mean, again, as I said, and I guess the diaspora, I mean, again, within Mizrahi, obviously, is the balance that, thank God, now, again, in many ways, like with Esther, they could have gone back.
Right.
That's what you said as well.
Sure.
But we have, thank God, a very strong Medina now, which I think was the first time ever, rather than diaspora helping Israel, it's Israel that are helping diaspora. In terms of most Rabbanim now, go to Israel and it really is supporting it, which is fascinating. Well, thank you so much for a fascinating and again, to see those links with those three stories. We know them so well, and yet we have never looked at them in that way. So thank you very, very much, and please continue the wonderful work you're doing in terms of authoring these incredibly important books for the community. And it's been a real pleasure hosting you tonight, and looking forward to hopefully seeing you live sometime soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next week, we are very much looking forward to Rabbi Pini Duna, also from America, the other side of America. We have Englewood tonight, and we're going to go across to Los Angeles, the other side, for somebody who is actually a Brit. Pini's been in LA for many, many years, but of course he comes from London. We look forward to hearing from him. So once again, Rabbi Halpen, thank you again for showing us tonight, and wish you a meaningful week, 9 days. You're about to come into it. We are now with the sun about setting where we are now in Av. And please God, this Tisha B'Av, again, should be the last one we need to keep in terms of mourning, and the stories of Esther and Danielle and Yosef, which was about redemption. Please God, we should get to that speaking hand soon.
Amen.
Again. And good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.